Hi, this is Shep Altshuler, publisher of Timesharing Today. Welcome to Timesharing Today Radio, featuring news and views of owners and industry professionals. Today we are being joined by Ken McKelvey, CEO of management company Fender Resorts and chairman of arda-roc. We will be discussing developments in litigation by the developer at the Caravanserai Beach Resort in St. Maarten, who terminated the rights of 2,000 owners to use their timeshares. The hardship in St. Maarten is just one more example of the need for greater protections for the rights of owners. Hi, Ken. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you, Shep. I appreciate the opportunity.
Before we get started, tell our listeners a little bit about the Fender Resorts and your involvement in the industry.
I'll be happy to. Fender Resorts has been in the timeshare property management business now for just over 35 years. We began in 1979. We're basically Eastern Seaboard management. We like to say that anything east of the Mississippi River we're most interested in. And we manage property from Massachusetts down through Maryland and into the Carolinas, obviously Myrtle Beach, and our home office and corporate headquarters is Myrtle Beach, down through Florida and in the Caribbean. We proudly manage two properties in the Caribbean, one in St. Maarten and one in Grand Cayman. And that's what we do is timeshare property management. Of course, we do sales, but our sales are sales of previously owned and rentals. We do not do any development work. We simply represent timeshare associations and their boards of directors.
Now, what was the problem at the Caravanserai of interest to you?
It was of interest to me in particular, not so much because of Fender Resorts, although we do have a property management contract with a property in St. Maarten, the Sea Palace Resort in Phillipsburg, but because of my workings with arda-roc. Arda-roc several years ago sponsored the drafting of timeshare legislation for the sovereign nation of St. Maarten. Thought there would be some movement on it over the last few years, but unfortunately, politics being what they are, it just did not get moved very well, and sort of set on the back corner. When this latest incident with Caravanserai came about, and there was a tremendous amount of pushback, predominantly by Americans, with respect to the island of St. Maarten, I think that the parliaments in St. Maarten sort of got the attention again, and if you will, they pulled our proposed legislation, which we being ROC assisted in drafting several years ago, pulled it off the shelf and reached out to the St. Maarten Timeshare Association to sort of relook at it and think about it and see if they could produce some improvements to their existing timeshare legislation. When the St. Maarten Timeshare Association was given that challenge of assisting Parliament and at least a draft of something that the government could look at, the St. Maarten Timeshare Association reached out to arda-roc for the same assistance that we provided previously. So we are right now in a position of joint working with the St. Maarten Timeshare Association, trying to go through some legislation that we had proposed many years ago and see what needs to be changed and in particulars and so forth, and trying to get a buy-in consensus and then put that forward to Parliament to see if we can't get some much-needed remedial changes done to the timeshare legislation and its operation and regulation in St. Maarten. So consequently, when this happened, I was most interested because I've been around for some time and I've been looking at trying to help the consumer in St. Maarten to get a bit better protection.
Spend a little bit of time telling us about the history of the Caravanserai Resort.
It's my understanding is it has been in St. Maarten in existence for many years. It began as a condominium project many years ago, and it has changed developer owners, if you will, a couple of times through the years. And it was successful at one time, but like so many, that they go through hard times and it gets sold or auctioned and so forth. So it's had quite a history of probably 10, 15 years of existence, to some degree or the other, in St. Maarten. This latest incident was really are predicated based on a loan that the owner-developer, if you will, had against the property.
Now, ownership in the Caribbean, St. Martin in particular, is generally different than what you might find in the U.S. with deeded properties. Is that correct?
It is possible to have deeded property in St. Martin. It is very difficult for timeshare. That was changed in 2005. There is a part of the civil code in St. Martin does now recognize a 152nd, what's known as right of apartment, because think of apartment as the same as a condominium. Up until 2005, legally there really was no way to partition a unit into a one interval out of 52, if you will. But from 2005 forward, that has always been the part of their civil code. Now, Caravanserai obviously began long before 2005, so they would not necessarily have fallen under the Act originally, but probably did have to prescribe to the Act one way or the other after 2005. And I think that was indicated in the ruling where the attorney talked about the right of rental.
How many owners are there of the Caravanserai, and how do they end up losing their rights?
Because there are no real regulations regarding timeshare in St. Martin, there are some laws on the books today, i.e. the 2005 legislation in particular. There is no regulation per se. There is no governmental or quasi-governmental or authority or body that you can go to. Consequently, when something like this happens, it's supposition. I've heard that there are 2,000 timeshare members there, and I want to use the word member because, as the judge said, this was rental, and so they never were deeded and weren't owners, but they were. I would say the better term is member, but member with long-term rights. That the judge clearly said, they survived the bankruptcy, they survived the auction.
So what actually took their rights away? How did they end up losing their rights? What was the mechanism that caused them to feel outed, so to speak?
Well, I would tell you from looking at it from afar, because I really wasn't that involved in actually what was happening as it occurred. I knew for some time, because I go to St. Martin probably once every other month. The Bank of Nova Scotia was foreclosing on the property due to non-payment of a mortgage, and they did it several times, and it wasn't successful for whatever reason. But then ultimately, the foreclosure and then the ultimate auction occurred, and then a new purchaser came in. Well, the new purchaser, the now new developer, simply stated that those were rental rights and that the rental rights do not survive a foreclosure and in the auction, that those rights were lost. He asserted that, he or she or the company, I don't know the people personally, he asserted that, and because there's no body to say, okay, you members, you owners, you come together and say that we disagree. The only thing you can do is you have to go to court, which is what these owners did. In St. Martin, the first place you go is what's known as the court of first instance, and that's what they did, and they were successful in St. Martin. And it can get very expensive paying attorneys, and it takes so long because there are only 3 judges in St. Martin. I'm talking about the Dutch side of St. Martin. There are only 3 judges, so you file a complaint in civil court in the court of first instance. It very well can take months and years before you can get it heard. And as is indicated, and this is just the first strike at the apple, if you will. The loser will absolutely file an appeal. As a matter of fact, they're expected to file an appeal because things down there are a bit different. Portions of what they do are they will accept testimony, and then portions are arguments of law, but they're not all treated at the same time. So this matter has just begun, and I say that only because it has just begun in terms of what these guys are going to have to pay. I was very happy to see that the court awarded some significant monetary funds to these 17, I think it was. And frankly, if you look at that number, probably that's about what the legal fees have been, unfortunately.
So do you know whether this extends to all 2,000 of the members?
Well, unfortunately, the matter itself was just to the complainants, i.e. the 17 or 60, whatever the number of the group was. I think there was a total of 60, and they chose 17 on the complaint, but I don't know that for sure. But I had heard that there were upwards of about 60 original complainants that were trying to seek redress. As the attorney has indicated, it does set up a good basis for those that haven't done anything. If you're a Caravanserai owner, member, and you've sort of just stood on the background and not done anything, if you acquired a fixed unit, fixed week, the old-time timeshare, you are probably protected by this litigation, but you can only enforce it by therefore going to court and enforcing it. Only those that went to court and the judge said you are right and the developer is wrong are now got the benefits of that order. And also, some of the Caravanserai owner members signed away their rights and accepted the hotel rooms. Well, I believe they're going to find they're done. They've got their hotel room, and that's what they're going to get. So while it was really, really good news for the owner member that hasn't done anything, and as long as what they were sold was a fixed unit, fixed week, then they're protected. But they're going to have to step forward to get that protection. And that's part of what we're trying to do with the new legislation is we're trying to convince Parliament, if you will, to adopt a quasi-governmental authority that sort of, want a better word, can supervise these sort of issues. The real problem at Caravanserai was when it happened, there was no one out there to contact all the owners because no one knew who they were. There's no one to say, hey guys, this is happening. You guys want to get together and say this is wrong. Luckily, 60 or so stood by and took some action, but you'll notice how long it has taken, and this is their second time that they've bitten at the apple, if you will. The second time they've paid attorneys and gone to a court. So they really have incurred some legal fees, but to their credit, they had stuck-to-itness and did it. I'm very proud of them, whoever they are. I don't know them personally. I do know that the St. Maarten Timeshare Association, when this thing first happened with Caravanserai, they implored RCI because they didn't know anyone else to even appeal to at least notify the members that were at least part of the exchange company that the St. Maarten Timeshare Association was going to open a website, if you will, and they did. And it's a long-winded, but if anybody out there that just wants to go to Timeshare St. Maarten, or you probably want to Google Timeshare St. Maarten, and there's a website that's Timeshare St. Maarten. So TIMESHARESTMAARTEN.com. The St. Maarten Timeshare Association created a web page for these people to at least be able to communicate, and also several of the members offered other intervals or other resorts, if you will, for very low prices. Sometimes just like a transfer fee, like it's at Sea Palace. We picked up a few of them, and I think we charged a transfer fee of $500 or something, because the people that come to St. Maarten love St. Maarten, and what had happened to them was absolutely unfair. But unfortunately, it did happen.
No, and these things do happen, as we know, in this industry. So the best way for these owners who might be still in a limbo state would be through the St. Maarten Timeshare Association. Is that correct?
Yes, and I had a conversation with at least one of the folks on that council, suggesting that now if it's happened, we probably need to do something like, I don't know what you call them, but maybe just create for them some sort of a blog, because there's really nothing we can do. Well, I'm not an injured party, and the St. Maarten Timeshare Association is not injured parties necessarily, but some way for these guys to come together cohesively instead of having all these splinter groups out there. But that unfortunately is what they need to do. They need to merge together. there were 60 this last time. If they had 400 or 500 that could, know each other well enough to say, okay, let's all go together and we'll put up $400 a piece or whatever the number is, and we'll file the same similar lawsuit. I think they would find they would probably be successful, as these have been. But unfortunately, they're going to have to take that next, step of action, because there's no regulator, and there's no regulating body out there. There's law. Timeshare does have rights in St. Martin, but you have to go to court to enforce those rights, unfortunately.
Do you know offhand whether the St. Martin Timeshare Association might recommend an attorney that these people could go to, or is that still not in place yet?
Well, it's not in place, and I've not really talked to the standing officers of the St. Martin Timeshare Association. I did reach out, as I say, to one individual who's been very instrumental in helping us to draft this new legislation. And so I think there'll be some fairly quick movement on restructuring that website. If nothing else, giving them a mechanism to come together, because, I don't think anyone wants anybody out there to think that we're trying to do anything other than assist consumers to get their rights back. It's bad for the island. I mean, it's bad for the sovereign nation of St. Martin. St. Martin their number one industry is tourism, and there are more timeshare units in St. Martin than there are hotel rooms. That's kind of a strange issue, but it's big. It's big for the cab drivers. It's big for the grocery stores. It's big for the restaurants. Having the name timeshare be drugged through the mud like this is terrible for the government of St. Martin. It's terrible for the individual that's working trying to earn a living, because they all depend, by and large, they depend on the tourism business, either by boat or by plane. And as I say, so many of them that come by airplane are timeshare owners. And most of the timeshare in St. Martin are well-run, well-operated. But unfortunately, like any business, there's sometimes they come upon bad times. And, mistake, and one of the things we're trying to do in the new legislation is a developer should not be able to put a mortgage on a piece of property. You can fine to put a mortgage on a piece of property because developers have to borrow money to build stuff. That's fine. But as we do here in the United States, when you sell off or long-term lease or rent, whatever it is you want to call that you do, but you in effect yield up a right of the apartment for a fixed period of time, that should be peeled off of the mortgage. I know banks don't want to hear those sort of things because it makes for a very convoluted mortgage, but that's only right. I'm not trying to assert that the bank necessarily did anything right or wrong, but if they would have done the right thing and peeled it off so that they should have been protected from the time they purchased it. A developer should not have the right, after they've sold a portion of the property, to go out there and mortgage that property, and that mortgage encumbers those people that have already purchased. That's just not right. And the new legislation will take care of that, but it'll only take care of it for, you can't look backwards. It helps in the long run, but unfortunately, everything will not come under the new legislation. It's just because it's about properties to be developed, and it is about sales. Now, I would argue that once the new legislation is passed, I believe that if you're currently in sales to any degree, even an association, as we represent the Sea Palace Timeshare Association, and we're doing sales there. I believe we would come under the act once the act is passed, which is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's a good thing. And I may be wrong about that. I'm not an attorney.
Out of curiosity, if any of our listeners who happen to be involved in this situation were interested in doing something over at the St. Martin Sea Palace, is that still an option for them, or is that just some limited opportunity there? No, we still have it open. Haven't taken in a lot of them, and I'm not trying to take in a lot of them because, if you hire a salesperson and they see you taking inventory and giving it to people, they kind of get a little upset at you. But I think it's the only right thing to do. But I would tell you that if I owned it at Caravanserai, I would be trying to figure out how can we develop a platform where we being the people that have been disenfranchised, how can we come together cohesively? And the internet is a great way of doing that. If any of our listeners would like to find out more about opportunities there at St. Maarten Sea Palace or Fender Resorts, how could they go about doing that?
They just send me an email, klm@defenderresorts.com. And for your listeners that are your readers and listeners that are timeshare owners at Caravanserai that haven't done anything, if you've got a fixed week and a fixed unit, drop me an email. I'm not going to try to sell you anything, but I'll collect those and if nothing else, try to share them with that body, because there's no point in having 15 and 20 each time to have to hire an attorney and do the process. There's several law firms down there that are capable. I would not recommend an attorney, but I easily could tell anyone there's 2 or 3 law firms that I would recommend. There's 2 or 3 attorneys on island that I know have some working knowledge of condominium law and some working knowledge of timeshare as it applies in St. Maarten.
The initial reaction in reading the headline that I saw, Caravanserai owners to get their units back, I thought it was all encompassing, but it's obviously not the case, and there's still work to be done, and I appreciate your taking the time to help gain some understanding about the situation there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And this concludes this broadcast of Timesharing Today Radio. You know, whether you're an owner or an industry professional, your opinions, suggestions, and experiences are all very important to us. So if you'd like to participate in a future broadcast, or if you'd like to suggest a topic for Timesharing Today Radio, please send an email to staff@tstoday.com. So until next time, happy timesharing.